Beaver, excuse me. Please talk to the owner of this establishment. Can you please leave that beaver alone? Do you have any idea what wood is going for these days? It's a great investment. It's gone up 265% over the past year. Logs are luxury. What is going for these days, but you need lumber.
So Corey, I'm sitting here in the suburbs of Philadelphia, and I'm surrounded by a lot of these Toll Brothers communities, and they're throwing up houses like crazy, and I'm seeing them drop off pallets of wood in, A-frame, siding, etc. But what we find recently here is they used to give you pre-construction pricing, and you lock that in, and then they built your house, and then you moved in. What's fascinating now, they're not giving pre-construction pricing. They're waiting for the house to be complete, and then they're putting a sales price on and selling. And the national statistics are something like its housing prices are now up $24,000 due to lumber costs. So this lumber thing is out of control. How did we get here?
Jason, how long do you think it takes the average Canadian lumber tree to grow?
I have no idea.
It takes 8 decades. So prior to COVID, there was actually some really interesting trends going on in the market. And there's sort of 3 that we can point to, 2 that are more natural, and then 1 that actually is a human element. In Canada, there were some issues with fires, and there were some issues with beetles that were destroying some of the lumber trees. And so even prior to COVID, we had this supply issue where production numbers started going down and down and down. Tied to that also was the human factor, which is there's been an increasing demand for ecological conservatism. We just, as a species, have decided we want to cut down less trees. We want to keep nature beautiful. And so that's putting increasing pressure to reduce the amount of deforestation we have.
It reminded me of 2 things though there. One, to tell me the Beatles didn't remind you of our solar inflation series we did because of the you're not getting a early frost in the die-off of the beetle population is why they're having beetle problems with the wood that I obviously found fascinating. The second was what I thought, they're trying to ecological conservatism in Canada to try to control that population. The other part they normally comes from in the US domestically is the Pacific Northwest. And as you reference those fires, those forest fires, what I deal with, in Northern California all the time.
It only takes a careless moment to turn this into this. Don't let forest fires be your fault. Make sure your fire is dead out.
Remember, only you can prevent forest fires.
And so it's not only just the forest fires, is a lot of that timber is now on national lands. And so a lot of people are pushing their Congress people to actually open up national lands so they can start harvesting forests in national lands. And to me, it's like, good luck under a Biden administration with that. But I thought about those 2 pieces fascinating. So I didn't want to cut you off. You were going to talk about where we were at pre-COVID anyway with the construction side.
No, I think that nails it. I mean, I think we really had these sort of natural factors and human factors that were leading to a dwindling supply. There's also some really interesting stuff I found, and I find this part particularly fascinating about sort of just the collective memory of producers and home builders from the 2008 crisis, in that there really seems to be a lingering fear of another crisis. And so a lot of the parties who are involved all the way through the lumber supply chain have become far more conservative in the amount of supply they're willing to have at any given time. And so just in general, all of these factors tied together, whether it's the ecological conservatism, the natural factors of the beetles and the forest fires, maybe it ties into some sort of global climate change in some way, the impact of 2008 that's in the lingering memory, all of that was leading to a decline in supply. And then we get COVID.
And that's where we step into supply chain disruptions and bullwhip effects. So it's not only the 80 years it takes to grow a tree in Canada, it's the 8 to 12 weeks it takes that piece of lumber to get from Canada to the end home down the street, right? And you have all the people in between. And COVID hits, disrupt supply chains, and supply chains notoriously have like a bullwhip effect where one little perturbation at the end of the supply chain, as it cascades through, can create a massive bullwhip effect down the chain. But then part of COVID hitting that's fascinating is we had this DIY system, right? Everybody now wants to renovate them home. Everything they've been putting off for the last 10 years, now it's time to renovate.
So let's just start with COVID happens, right?
Yeah.
And to your point, you get this supply chain disruption because everybody is now suddenly in lockdown. So again, if we look at production numbers that occurred in April 2020, they were actually close to 40 to 50% lower than their all-time highs just a few years earlier. So they had been in decline, but they took a really significant dip. And then where I think things get really interesting, and this ties to another video we did, the story about reflation, is that markets rebounded so fast and people suddenly had so much money in their pocket and they couldn't spend it elsewhere. And they're forced to be at home and look around their house and spend all that time noticing the things that they no longer like about their house. It suddenly becomes, wow, we can go repair things. And so you get this beautiful setup for a supply-demand mismatch in the short term, which leads to this explosion in lumber prices.
But I also wonder, recently they had the lumber trader on Oddlots podcast, which was fantastic. And he was talking about, the things you're talking about with recency biases. In 2018, there was such a low in lumber. Everybody was kind of scorned by that. So there's a lot of hesitance there. And then people are like, well, let's crank up the sawmills. It's like, what sawmills? You can't crank up sawmills. Like that just doesn't exist. So you have this like classical GameStop like short squeeze, it looks like, right? Lumber's taking off. It took off last year in 2020, and now it's just accelerating again. So part of you as a trader has to go, man, maybe I should get on this lumber trade. But then that would be a dramatic fallacy to know what you're not missing in the lumber trade. So how do you think about that lumber trade?
Well, this is one of the things that really confuses me, right? Because I think speculators stepped in March and April, and they started to short sell lumber futures, right? Which was probably the right call for what was going on at the time. And then I do think there is this short squeeze element, right? That as everything reopened, demand for lumber took off. All of a sudden, these traders and speculators are squeezed out of their position. As lumber futures start to run, you're going to get the systematic traders like the CTAs start to chase it. And I guess lumber futures are notoriously illiquid. That limit up, limit down is very frequent in that space. And so, but there's really two things I wonder, right? We generally expect markets, both financial markets and real economy markets, to be reasonably efficient. So if lumber is so overpriced, why aren't the producers coming in to short sell the futures as a hedge to their production? And on the other hand, I do wonder, as housing prices keep going up and up and up, is that going to invite certain people to suddenly say, maybe it's time for me to sell my house, and we're suddenly going to see a glut of supply of housing inventory hit the market?
Well, the other part of those is the deliverability of those contracts. That tends to keep people away a lot of times too, as we saw with the oil deliverability in 2020. I also wonder at a certain price point, we always have replacement value, right? You're going to have other composite materials, whether it's structurally insulated panels, concrete block construction. At some point, people shift away from stick-built homes. And the other part of that is, I was trying to research, southern yellow pine, and for some reason, people aren't really fancy on southern yellow pine. They don't view it as a perfect construction material. But at what point do people use southern yellow pine for construction? You have a lot of those replacement things that can come in at certain price points, and that tends to, like, in the end, collapse a market. But I really wonder if this is part of those. The question is this a classic example the market can stay irrational longer? You could say solvent, in that we know eventually everything's going to catch up and lumber will come back down. But how long is that going to take?
Well, I do wonder if part of the reopening trade is ironically going to be an unwind of some of these commodity prices. if the demand for lumber was driven by a population that was forced to work from home and stay at home and was buying all this lumber to renovate their homes, if that all disappears because suddenly everyone's going out and they're no longer doing home renovation projects, is the new housing construction demand necessarily going to be sufficient to keep these prices from going out of control? And again, at what point do the prices become so elevated that suppliers of housing enter the market and producers of lumber just step in and start locking in those future prices and short selling those futures?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting when we covered it in our inflation trade episode, is you see a spike in like copper and lumber. So people are like, inflation's coming, this is the reflation trade. But these could be very transitory reopening trades and we could see it go back. Not saying we know what's going to happen, but that's an interesting, way of looking at it. So I'm curious, what was your takeaway from lumber? Are you gonna start a sawmill in the Northeast? What's the next steps for you?
I'm waiting for the moment. Do you remember back in, I think it was 2008, 2009, people were stealing copper gutters off of people's houses?
Yes.
That's what I'm waiting for. That's what I'm calling peak lumber, is when people start ripping the lumber off of other people's houses. I'm sure they're probably stealing from construction sites already, but once we get real evidence of a black market for lumber, that's my sign of a top.
I love that one. Actually, you just gave me nightmares because I was a commercial real estate developer and you're constantly protecting your sites from people stealing copper and other materials. And yeah, you're right. In my mind's eye, when I see a truck go by with a pallet of lumber, I'm just thinking like it's pallet of gold bars. It's amazing how our mind can shift that quickly. And then pretty soon it'll probably just go back to detritus lumber on a job site.
I'm trying to build a new home and then renovate that home at the same time. I need lumber.
Now make sure you like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss one of these amazing episodes.